You know that moment when karma decides to wear designer heels and stomp directly on someone's ego? I'm Alicia Brandon, and I got front row seats to the most spectacular professional implosion I've ever witnessed. All because someone thought my name wasn't shiny enough for their precious masthead. Reader's Daily had always been the kind of place where ambition went to die slowly, drowning in lukewarm coffee and passive-aggressive email chains. I'd been there 3 years, grinding out investigative pieces that actually mattered while watching editors slap more prominent bylines on work that barely deserved to exist. The newsroom smelled perpetually of burnt coffee and crushed dreams, fluorescent lights humming their monotonous death song over cubicles that had seen better decades. My desk sat in the corner, strategically positioned where I could watch the entire editorial hierarchy play out like a poorly scripted corporate drama. The sports guys commanded the prime real estate near the windows, their voices carrying across the floor as they debated batting averages and trade rumors. The lifestyle section huddled together near the break room, trading recipes and gossip in equal measure. And there I was, the investigative reporter who'd broken more real stories in 3 years than most of my colleagues had in their entire careers, relegated to the shadows with the freelancers and interns. The municipal corruption story had consumed my life for 4 months. 4 months of sleeping 3 hours a night, surviving on vending machine coffee and whatever takeout I could afford on my laughably modest salary. I'd memorized every city council meeting transcript from the past 2 years, cross-referenced every contract award, and built a network of sources who trusted me with information that could end careers, including their own. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, the city clerk who'd worked in municipal government for 37 years, had been my breakthrough source. She'd called me on a Thursday evening in October, her voice shaking as she described irregularities in the bidding process that had been keeping her awake for months. "I've got grandchildren, Alicia," she'd whispered into the phone. "I can't let them inherit a city built on corruption." Then there was Tony Castellano, the construction foreman who'd witnessed bid rigging firsthand. He'd agreed to meet me at a diner 40 miles outside the city limits, his weathered hands trembling as he showed me photographs of substandard materials being used in city projects. "They're cutting corners everywhere," he'd said, his eyes haunted. "Someone's going to get hurt." The story was airtight, explosive, and entirely mine. Every quote verified, every document authenticated, every source protected through careful reporting that had taken me months to perfect. I'd traced the money through shell companies, uncovered the nepotism in contract awards, and documented safety violations that put entire neighborhoods at risk. That Tuesday started like any other, until I submitted my piece and watched my career take a turn I never saw coming. "We want a more prominent name up front," Editor-in-Chief Thomas Wright announced, sliding my article back across his glass desk like it was contaminated. His office reeked of ego and expensive cologne, walls lined with awards that belonged to people who'd left years ago. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd spent sleepless nights crafting this story, had risked my safety meeting sources in parking garages and abandoned warehouses. Mrs. Hayes had trusted me with documents that could land her in federal prison. Tony Castellano had risked his livelihood to expose safety violations that could collapse bridges. And Wright wanted to hand it all to Jackson Miller like a participation trophy. I stared at him, processing the casual dismissal of months of work. "A more prominent name? Jackson Miller will take the byline. He's got the recognition factor we need." Wright adjusted his tie, not meeting my eyes. Jackson Miller, the guy who couldn't investigate his way out of a paper bag if someone drew him a map and provided a flashlight. Jackson, who'd spent the last 4 months covering city council meetings with all the depth of a puddle, writing puff pieces about new playground equipment and ribbon cuttings. Jackson didn't write this. He wasn't even in the same zip code when I was interviewing councilmen at midnight. My voice stayed level, professional. Years of swallowing similar indignities had taught me that much. Wright's fingers drummed against his desk, a nervous habit that emerged whenever he was about to say something particularly awful. "Look, Alicia, your work is solid. But Jackson has name recognition. He's been here longer. Readers trust him. Readers trust him to cover Little League games and pancake breakfast fundraisers. This story involves federal wire fraud and safety violations that could kill people. It's not personal, Alicia. It's business." Right. Business. The kind where women's work gets credit laundered through male colleagues because apparently, readers can't handle the radical concept of competent female journalists. The kind where months of dangerous reporting gets handed to someone who'd never met a single source, never lost sleep over the implications of what they'd uncovered, never felt the weight of responsibility that comes with exposing corruption that affects thousands of lives. I thought about Mrs. Hayes, how she'd cried when she handed me the documents that proved the bidding process had been rigged for over 2 years. I thought about Tony Castellano, whose hands had shaken as he described watching city inspectors take bribes to overlook substandard concrete. I thought about the families living in neighborhoods where infrastructure was failing because someone had decided their safety was worth less than a campaign contribution. My sources won't talk to Jackson, I said finally. They don't know him. They don't trust him. Then you can brief him. Help him understand the story. The audacity was breathtaking. Not only was Wright stealing my byline, he wanted me to train my replacement to discuss my own work. Like I was some kind of investigative research assistant whose job was to make Jackson Miller look competent. I gathered my things, said nothing, and walked out. Sometimes silence is the most devastating response you can give. But as I sat at my desk that afternoon, watching Jackson Miller fumble through my research notes like he was trying to decode ancient hieroglyphics, I realized something important. Wright had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that stealing my byline meant stealing my story. But the story wasn't in the article, it was in the reporting. And Jackson Miller had no idea how to report. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I opened my laptop and began typing, not another article, but something far more surgical. I crafted a detailed account of my investigation process, complete with timestamps, source interviews, and my original draft notes. Then I did something that would make Wright's expensive cologne turn to cold sweat. I posted it all on my personal Medium account. Not the full story, that would violate my contract and compromise my sources. But the methodology, the timeline, the meticulous documentation of my reporting process. I titled it The Invisible Byline, When Your Work Becomes Someone Else's Legacy. I included just enough detail to make it clear what story I was referencing, without crossing legal lines. The post began with a simple question: what happens when 4 months of investigative reporting gets handed to someone who never met a single source? I described my process, the late nights spent cross-referencing public records, the careful cultivation of sources who risked their careers to expose corruption, the painstaking verification of every fact and figure. I wrote about Mrs. Hayes, though I didn't use her name. I described the evening she called me, the way her voice shook as she described irregularities that had been keeping her awake for months. I wrote about how she'd trusted me with documents that could destroy her career, how she'd said she couldn't let her grandchildren inherit a city built on corruption. I wrote about Tony Castellano, again without naming him. I described the diner 40 miles outside the city limits, the way his weathered hands trembled as he showed me photographs of substandard materials being used in city projects. I wrote about the fear in his eyes when he said someone was going to get hurt. I wrote about the shell companies, the nepotism, the safety violations. I wrote about spending my own money on gas to drive to remote locations to meet sources who were too scared to talk on the phone. I wrote about the night I'd followed a city contractor to a warehouse and documented him loading substandard materials onto trucks bound for a school construction site. And then I wrote about the meeting with Wright, the casual dismissal of months of work, the assumption that readers couldn't handle a woman's name on a story about municipal corruption. The post went live at 11:47 p.m. on Thursday. By Friday morning, it had been shared 847 times. By noon, it had been shared 2,400 times. By evening, it had been shared 7,800 times. The comments section exploded with support from journalists, readers, and sources who'd had similar experiences. People began sharing their own stories of stolen bylines, of work reassigned to more prominent names, of women's investigative reporting being credited to male colleagues. My phone buzzed with messages from colleagues I hadn't heard from in years. Former classmates from journalism school reached out. Other reporters shared their own byline theft stories. The hashtag #InvisibleByline hashtag started trending on Twitter. But the most important response came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Hayes herself. She'd read my Medium post and called me that Friday evening, her voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. "Alicia," she said, "I've been following the response to your article. I want you to know that I'm proud to have been your source. And if anyone asks, I'll tell them exactly who did the real reporting on this story." Monday morning arrived with all the subtlety of a freight train carrying TNT. Wright's office door rattled on its hinges as he slammed it shut, his voice carrying through the allegedly soundproof walls like a bullhorn at a library. "Why are readers accusing us of plagiarism?" The beautiful irony wasn't lost on me. Reader's Daily's own readership had connected the dots between my Medium post and Jackson's brilliant investigative piece. Comments flooded in questioning how Jackson had managed such detailed reporting in areas where he'd never worked, with sources who'd never heard of him. The newspaper's Facebook page became a battleground. Readers posted screenshots of my Medium article alongside Jackson's story, highlighting the impossible timeline and questioning how he'd managed to conduct months of investigative work in the space of a weekend. The comments were brutal and specific. How did Jackson Miller interview sources in October when he was covering the high school football playoffs? This reporting methodology sounds exactly like what Alicia Brandon described in her Medium post. Why won't Jackson Miller respond to questions about his sources? My phone buzzed with messages from colleagues. Holy shit, Alicia. The internet is going nuclear. Wright's been in crisis meetings all morning. Jackson's nowhere to be found. But the most telling response came from our own newsroom. Reporters who'd been quiet for years suddenly found their voices. Lucy Patterson from the lifestyle section sent me a private message. This happened to me 2 years ago. Wright gave my expose on the school board corruption to Michael Sterling. I was too scared to speak up. James Rodriguez from Sports wrote, my investigation into the city's youth sports funding scandal got reassigned to Wright's nephew. I documented everything but never knew what to do with it. The Columbia Journalism Review picked up the story by Tuesday. The headline read, When Credit Goes Missing, a case study in editorial malpractice. Local journalism Twitter exploded with support, sharing their own byline theft stories. The hashtag invisible byline started trending nationally. Wright called me into his office Wednesday morning. His usual composure had cracked. The expensive cologne couldn't mask the scent of panic that seemed to seep from his pores. His hand shook slightly as he gestured for me to sit. We need to discuss your Medium post, he said, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. What about it? I kept my voice neutral, professional. The same tone I'd used when he'd stolen my work. It's causing problems. Problems, I repeated. You mean accountability? Wright's jaw clenched. You're making the paper look bad. You're making me look bad. I'm telling the truth about what happened. If that makes you look bad, maybe you should examine your actions, not my response to them. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. Wright tried everything, veiled threats about my contract, suggestions that I was being unprofessional, hints that my career prospects might suffer if I didn't clarify my Medium post. But his leverage had evaporated along with his credibility. By Wednesday afternoon, the story had been picked up by 3 major journalism websites. The Society of Professional Journalists issued a statement condemning editorial byline theft. The Columbia Journalism School's ethics professor used my case as an example in a widely read blog post about newsroom integrity. Jackson Miller, meanwhile, had gone completely silent. He'd stopped answering his phone, stopped responding to emails, and hadn't been seen in the newsroom since Monday morning. Rumor had it he was holed up in his apartment, refusing to come out. The damage was swift and comprehensive. Reader's Daily subscriptions dropped by 12% in the first week. Advertisers began asking questions about editorial integrity. The board of directors, suddenly concerned about their reputation, announced a comprehensive review of editorial practices. But the most satisfying moment came Thursday morning when Tony Castellano called me directly. Alicia, he said, his voice strong and clear, I saw what that editor did to you. I want you to know that if anyone asks, I'll tell them who the real reporter was on this story. You earned that byline. By Thursday, Reader's Daily had issued a correction, a laughably inadequate 2-sentence note buried on page 12. But the damage was done. Wright's credibility had evaporated like morning mist. The board of directors, suddenly concerned about their reputation, announced a comprehensive review of editorial practices. The correction itself was a masterpiece of corporate cowardice. An editing error resulted in an incorrect byline on Tuesday's municipal corruption story. The error has been noted. No apology, no acknowledgement of the months of work that had been stolen, no mention of my name. Just an editing error, like someone had accidentally hit the wrong key on a keyboard. But readers weren't buying it. The comments section exploded with outrage. People posted links to my Medium article, demanding a real explanation. The paper's social media accounts were flooded with questions about editorial integrity. Local news outlets began investigating the story behind the story. I submitted my resignation that Friday, effective immediately. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I'd already lined up a position with the Metropolitan Observer, a publication that actually valued investigative journalism over editorial ego. They'd reached out after reading my Medium post, offering me a senior investigative role with complete byline protection written into my contract. The offer had come from editor-in-chief Maria Santos, a woman who'd built her career on the principle that good journalism comes from good journalists, not from shuffling names around to satisfy marketing concerns. "We need reporters who do the work," she'd said during our phone interview. "And we believe in putting the right names on the right stories." My resignation letter was brief and professional. I thanked Wright for the opportunity to work at Reader's Daily, expressed my commitment to ethical journalism, and wished the paper well in its future endeavors. I didn't mention the byline theft, didn't reference the Medium post, didn't air any grievances. I simply resigned and moved on. Wright's replacement arrived 2 weeks later. Amanda Foster, a veteran editor from the Chicago Tribune, had been hired specifically to restore editorial integrity to Reader's Daily. Her first act was to implement a new byline policy that required editors to document any changes to story attribution. Her second act was to issue a public apology for the paper's handling of the municipal corruption story. Jackson Miller quietly transferred to the sports desk, where his talent for fiction would be less problematic. He never wrote another investigative piece. The last I heard, he was covering high school basketball and writing the occasional restaurant review. The municipal corruption story I'd broken led to 3 indictments and a complete overhaul of the city's contracting process. Mrs. Hayes was recognized by the city council for her courage in exposing the corruption. Tony Castellano was promoted to senior foreman at his construction company after his supervisor realized his commitment to safety made him an invaluable employee. The real victory, though, was smaller and more personal. 3 weeks after my resignation, I received an email from a young reporter in Denver who'd read my Medium post. She'd been pressured to give her byline to a male colleague and wasn't sure what to do. We talked for an hour about documentation, about knowing your worth, about the importance of fighting for credit when you've earned it. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting better. But sometimes, just sometimes, it's also inspiring other people to fight for what they've earned. These days, I wake up excited about my work again. My name appears exactly where it should, above the stories I write, in the same font size as everyone else's. Funny how revolutionary that feels. The byline isn't just about credit, it's about ownership, responsibility, and the fundamental respect for the person who did the work. When we steal bylines, we don't just steal recognition, we steal identity. To every journalist who's watched their work get handed to someone else's ego, your stories matter. Your name matters. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth about what happened. The pen, as they say, is mightier than the sword. But a well-documented Medium post? That's a nuclear weapon wrapped in professional courtesy. Trust me on this one. The aftermath rippled through the journalism world for months. Wright's comprehensive review became a case study in damage control gone wrong. The board brought in an outside consultant who discovered that byline theft had been systematic at Reader's Daily for years. Not just my story, dozens of pieces had been reassigned to boost certain writers' profiles while burying others. The Metropolitan Observer published my follow-up investigation into editorial malpractice across the industry. It won a regional journalism award 6 months later. My byline was prominently displayed, exactly where it belonged. Jackson Miller eventually left journalism entirely. Last I heard he was selling insurance in suburban Phoenix. Wright found work at a small trade publication covering the concrete industry. Sometimes karma doesn't just wear designer heels, sometimes it makes you cover municipal infrastructure for the rest of your career. The municipal corruption story led to federal charges against 2 city council members and a complete restructuring of the contracting process. The city saved approximately $2.4 million in the first year alone after implementing new transparency measures. My sources, the ones who trusted me with their careers? They still call me directly when they have stories. Trust, once earned through actual reporting, doesn't transfer with stolen bylines. These days, when young journalists ask me about navigating newsroom politics, I tell them the same thing: document everything, know your worth, and never let anyone convince you that your name isn't good enough for your own work. The most dangerous thing you can do to a journalist is underestimate their ability to tell a story. Especially when that story is about you. Reader's Daily folded 18 months later. The Metropolitan Observer is still publishing, still winning awards, still putting the right names on the right stories. Some battles are worth fighting, even when, especially when, you're fighting them alone.